Geography is the first limit. Military power reaches its limit long before the first shot is fired. It stops at runways that cannot be extended, ports that cannot be deepened, and sea lanes that funnel traffic into narrow spaces. In the Western Pacific, a handful of airfields and ports quietly determine how much force can arrive, how fast, and for how long. For decades, American planning assumed access would be available when needed. Forward bases in Japan, Guam, and Allied territories were treated as stable platforms, not contested terrain. That assumption held while distance worked only against weaker opponents. It holds less when geography itself becomes a constraint. This is where pressure begins. Forces do not spread evenly across a map. They converge. Aircraft, fuel, maintenance crews, and munitions move through the same limited corridors. As distance grows, timelines stretch. As timelines stretch, exposure increases. Global reach looks expansive. On a map, it compresses. The decision point arrives quietly. Reinforce forward positions early and accept predictability, or hold forces back and lose time. There is no neutral option. Each choice narrows the next, not dominance. Position. Once access points are fixed, flexibility declines. Reinforcement becomes scheduling, not strategy. Geography does not cause collapse by itself, but it defines where pressure accumulates first, and where options disappear. Logistics DECIDES duration. Power does not fail all at once. It thins, it stretches, then it stalls. The limiting factor is rarely the number of forces deployed, but how long they can be sustained. At Diego Garcia, fuel storage tanks and preposition supplies look static on satellite images. In reality, they mark the edge of endurance. Modern U.S. operations are built for speed, not depth. Precision strikes, rapid deployments, short warning cycles. What follows is heavier and slower. Fuel convoys, spare parts, maintenance crews, and airlift schedules that cannot be improvised. Every additional day forward increases dependency on a chain that grows longer and more exposed. This creates a quiet compression of time. Early phases feel decisive. Later phases become conditional. Aircraft require more maintenance than flight hours allow. Tankers become as critical as fighters. Lift capacity stops being a support function and becomes the main constraint. Here, assumptions begin to fail. Winning the opening phase does not guarantee control of the next. The decision is no longer whether to apply force, but whether it can be kept in place without degrading readiness elsewhere. Reinforcing one theater weakens another. Stockpiles fall faster than replacement cycles, not speed, endurance. Once sustainment becomes the limiting factor, escalation choices narrow. Operations shorten by necessity, not preference. Strategy shifts from shaping outcomes to managing depletion. The next pressure does not come from the battlefield, but from the systems that must replace what is consumed. Industrial capacity sets the ceiling. The constraint becomes visible far from the front. Inside missile assembly lines, shipyards, and precision machining halls, output moves at a pace that does not accelerate under pressure. A factory cannot surge the way a squadron can. It ramps slowly, if at all. For much of the post-Cold War period, U.S. defense industry optimized for efficiency, not volume. Production runs shortened. Specialized suppliers narrowed. Stockpiles were treated as buffers, not foundations. That logic worked while conflicts were limited and consumption predictable. High-intensity warfare breaks that balance. Precision weapons disappear faster than they can be replaced. Ship maintenance queues lengthen. Subcomponents sourced through global supply chains introduce delays no planner can compress. The timeline between expenditure and replenishment stretches beyond operational needs. This is where choice quietly collapses. Decision-makers face a narrowing menu: conserve munitions and accept reduced pressure, or spend them and accept future scarcity. Neither option restores flexibility. Each shifts risk forward. As inventories thin, planning becomes defensive. Commitments are weighed against what cannot be replaced in time, not reach. Replacement. Once industrial tempo becomes the ceiling, strategy bends around production calendars. Campaign length is no longer a matter of will, but of throughput. The next constraint emerges when advanced systems, built for advantage, deepen dependency instead technological superiority, increases dependence. The contradiction appears at the center of modern command rooms. Screens glow with live feeds from satellites, sensors, and networks that promise clarity and speed. The system works until it doesn't. A single disrupted layer can dull the edge of the entire force. U.S. military power has been shaped around networked advantage. Satellites guide weapons, synchronize units, and compress decision time. Data moves faster than commanders once imagined possible, but this speed creates reliance. Each system assumes the others are present, connected, and uncontested. Pressure builds quietly. Redundancy exists on paper, but complexity limits improvisation. Replacing a damaged aircraft is difficult. Replacing a disrupted network under pressure is harder. When links degrade, forces do not collapse, but they slow, hesitate, and lose precision. This is the pause. More sensors do not always mean more control. Sometimes they mean more points of failure. Decision cycles tighten. Assumptions about visibility and coordination no longer hold. Commanders adapt, but adaptation costs time that modern conflict does not offer freely. Not advantage, dependence. As reliance deepens, options narrow. Operations that require constant connectivity become riskier. Simpler actions regain value but cannot fully replace what is lost. The system does not fail dramatically. It constrains quietly. The next pressure emerges when this dependence extends beyond technology into political permission and allied access. Allied access is conditional. Not OWNED, the consequence arrives before the decision is made. Aircraft are ready, ships are positioned, but access still depends on permission. At bases in Japan, Europe, and the Middle East, runways and ports exist physically, yet their use remains political. For decades, U.S. strategy treated Allied basing as stable infrastructure. Agreements were signed. Facilities expanded. Planning assumed availability during crisis. That assumption weakens when conflict carries domestic risk for host governments. Access becomes a calculation, not a guarantee. Pressure accumulates slowly. Allies weigh escalation against internal politics, economic exposure, and retaliation risk. Delays are framed as consultation. Restrictions are framed as technical. The effect is the same. Timelines slip. Options compress. This is the quiet constraint. Forces can be deployed globally, but they cannot operate independently of sovereign consent. Even limited conditions, flight restrictions, sortie caps, port access windows, reshape operational plans. Commanders adjust, but adjustment costs momentum, not control, permission. As reliance on Allied territory deepens, independent action space narrows. Alternatives disappear quickly. New bases cannot be created on demand. Diplomatic reassurance does not move aircraft faster. Strategy begins to orbit around what allies will allow, not what planners prefer. This is not alliance failure. It is alliance reality, and it feeds directly into the next pressure. How escalation risk forces restraint even when access exists. Escalation control limits usable force. The limitation appears at the moment power should peak. Options exist, but they remain unused. Certain targets are avoided. Certain responses are delayed. Not because they would fail, but because they might succeed too decisively. Escalation control becomes the governing logic. In conflicts involving nuclear-armed or near-peer states, force is applied under an invisible ceiling. Missile batteries near contested borders, command nodes tied to strategic forces, and early warning systems sit inside zones planners deliberately circle. The risk is not battlefield defeat. It is loss of control. Pressure builds through restraint. Each avoided action preserves stability but narrows tactical freedom. Commanders are forced to choose proportionality over advantage. Even when access and capability align, intent is filtered through escalation management frameworks shaped during the Cold War and reinforced since. This is the tightening moment. Maximum power exists largely as deterrence, not as a usable tool. Once conflict begins, the usable portion shrinks rapidly. Decision makers are no longer asking what can be done, but what must not be done. The range of acceptable actions contracts first, not last. Not dominance, restraint. As escalation thresholds harden, operations become predictable. Opponents learn which lines will not be crossed. That predictability feeds anticipation, counterplanning, and delay. Force remains present, but flexibility fades. The next pressure emerges when this restraint, combined with global posture, makes movement visible long before decisions are executed. Global posture creates predictability. The contradiction is structural. The same global presence that enables rapid response also makes movement observable. Carrier strike groups leave port on known schedules. Aircraft deployments register on public trackers. Satellite coverage ensures little stays hidden for long. Visibility is not accidental. It is a feature of deterrence and reassurance. But in conflict, it becomes a constraint. When forces move through established corridors, sea lanes, air routes, logistics hubs, their intentions are inferred before they arrive. Surprise erodes quietly. Pressure accumulates through anticipation. Opponents do not need perfect intelligence. They need enough warning to prepare. Countermeasures begin before decisions are finalized. Defensive systems activate. Political signaling accelerates. The window for initiative narrows. This is where timing compresses. Transparency favors the defender. Movement takes time, reaction can be immediate. Once deployments are tracked, options shrink to those already anticipated. Flexibility declines not because plans are flawed, but because they are visible. Not presence, uncertainty. As predictability hardens, commitment costs rise. Every move signals intent and reduces room for adjustment. Hesitation invites counteraction. Speed invites escalation risk. Strategy becomes boxed in by its own posture. The next pressure does not come from the opponent's strength, but from the rising cost of sustaining visible commitments over time. Cost curves erode flexibility. The consequence appears in procurement tables, not battle maps. Each new platform costs more, arrives slower, and replaces fewer systems than the one before it. Advanced aircraft programs, missile defenses, and naval vessels deliver capability, but at a narrowing scale. This is not inefficiency. It is arithmetic. Precision, survivability, and integration demand complexity. Complexity drives cost. As unit prices rise, inventories thin. Losses matter sooner. Replacements take longer. Force structure hardens into something less elastic. Pressure builds through accumulation. Budget decisions made years earlier lock in today's constraints. Funds committed to sustain high-end systems are unavailable for mass or redundancy. Trade-offs become permanent. Planners compensate with assumptions about availability and deterrence holding. Then comes the pause. Quantity used to absorb shock. Now it amplifies risk. A single loss carries strategic weight. Escalation decisions are influenced not only by intent, but by what cannot be replaced quickly. Conservation becomes strategy by default, not superiority, affordability. As cost curves steepen, flexibility collapses first. Options that require attrition tolerance disappear. Strategy shifts toward preservation and signaling. Power remains formidable, but its use becomes increasingly selective. The next pressure emerges when time itself becomes the scarcest resource. Compressing decisions faster than institutions can adapt. Time compression forces reaction. The limitation shows up before choices are fully formed. Warning windows shrink. Decision cycles tighten. Systems designed to buy time now consume it. Early warning sensors, rapid strike platforms, and compressed command loops reduce the space between detection and consequence. Consider the reality inside modern alert networks. Sensor layers trigger assessments in minutes, sometimes seconds. Options that once allowed deliberation now demand immediate alignment across military, political, and alliance channels. Coordination becomes the constraint. Delay becomes risk. Pressure builds unevenly. Institutions move slower than signals. Procedures meant to prevent mistakes lengthen response just enough to matter. Meanwhile, adversary timelines do not pause. Reaction replaces initiative. Strategy becomes a sequence of guarded responses rather than shaping moves. This is the quiet failure point. When time compresses, reversibility disappears. Actions taken to avoid escalation can still lock in escalation pathways. Choices narrow not because leaders hesitate, but because the clock removes alternatives before they can be evaluated. The margin for correction collapses first, not speed, control. As reaction dominates, planning horizons shorten. Long-range objectives give way to crisis management. Each decision is judged against immediate consequences, not strategic positioning. Power still exists, but it is spent managing momentum rather than directing it. The final pressure emerges when all these constraints fuse, revealing what military power can no longer change. Power is a system, and systems have EDGES. The deepest limit is not military. It is structural. Power does not operate as a single instrument that can be pointed at a problem. It functions as an interlocked system: geography, logistics, industry, technology, alliances, cost, and time, each placing quiet boundaries on the others. When those boundaries align, options vanish without a decisive moment. This is where long-term consequences take shape. Strategy shifts away from decisive outcomes and toward positioning, denial, and risk management. Control becomes temporary. Influence becomes conditional. The objective is no longer to dominate events, but to prevent loss of leverage while navigating constraints that cannot be removed. Over time, this reshapes behavior beyond the battlefield. Allies hedge rather than commit fully. Industrial planning prioritizes resilience over surge. Military doctrine emphasizes dispersion and survivability instead of concentration. Conflict becomes less about victory and more about managing exposure within narrow margins. Here, the meaning of power changes, not size, structure, not ownership, access. The United States remains capable of extraordinary force. But that force now operates inside a tighter framework, where timing matters more than scale and position matters more than presence. Once those edges are reached, power does not disappear. It simply stops producing decisive outcomes. Understanding this does not weaken strategy, it clarifies it. It explains why limits matter more than strength.